My name is Serena Calder, and for 4 years, I lived inside a life that looked curated to perfection. The house on Alder Street belonged to Julian Mercer before it belonged to me. It carried old money in its bones, tall windows, intricate crown molding, floors that remembered generations of careful living. Julian carried himself the same way. Polished. Intentional. Impeccable in the way only men raised on inherited confidence tend to be. He ran a philanthropic foundation built on inherited wealth and public admiration. I built my career in forensic accounting, untangling financial fraud for corporations that preferred quiet resolutions over public scandal. Different worlds, people always said. But we had made one world from the two. We were admired for different reasons. He was the face, the charismatic director who filled ballrooms and moved donors with the precision of a conductor. I was the structure. The steady, invisible architecture that held everything upright. I told myself that was enough. That complimenting someone was the same as completing them. Structures, I've since learned, can hold enormous weight long after the cracks begin. And cracks always begin somewhere. The first crack was small enough to ignore. A payment labeled strategic advisory buried in the foundation's quarterly statements. It wasn't my responsibility to review them. Julian managed the foundation's finances entirely. But one evening, while we sat on the back porch with wine and paperwork, he pushed the documents toward me casually. "Just a quick glance," he said. "Fresh eyes." The firm receiving the advisory funds was unfamiliar. No name I recognized from the donor circles we moved in. No presence I could place from the board meetings I occasionally attended on Julian's arm. When I asked who they were, he answered without hesitation. "Consultants. Confidential. You know how it goes with some of our major donors, they prefer discretion." He kissed my forehead after he said it. And that was when something shifted, something so subtle I might have missed it if I weren't trained to notice the weight of incongruence. The gesture felt practiced. Not false, exactly. Just rehearsed. I filed it away the way I file everything that doesn't yet have a category. Quietly. Without disturbing the surface. I told myself I was overanalyzing. It is an occupational hazard, the forensic mind does not clock out. Patterns appear everywhere when you spend your days hunting them inside spreadsheets and transaction logs. I had brought suspicion home before and embarrassed myself with it. I was not willing to do that again. So I watched instead. Julian became slightly more guarded over the following weeks. Not dramatically. Nothing that would register to anyone who wasn't already paying attention. Calls taken outside the kitchen door. His laptop screen angled away when I passed behind him. A subtle tightening in the set of his shoulders when I entered a room unexpectedly, the kind that softened immediately once he saw it was only me. Nothing dramatic, I kept reminding myself. But nothing exists in isolation either. In forensic accounting, we are taught that a single anomaly proves nothing. 2 anomalies are coincidence. There is a pattern. By the time February gave way to March, I had quietly catalogued 7. Julian brought me flowers one Thursday with no occasion attached. I arranged them in a vase and said nothing. But I started keeping a private log on a device Julian did not know I owned. Different is where truth begins. The proof came on a Tuesday night when Julian left his tablet syncing to our shared household cloud. He had gone to bed early, a headache, he said. He kissed me gently at the temple before going upstairs. I stayed in the study to finish my own work. When the tablet lit up on the side table, I assumed it was a calendar notification. It was an email thread. The consulting firm appeared again, but this time embedded in a correspondence that was neither brief nor professional. Messages spanning months. Plans for weekends that appeared in Julian's schedule as board retreats, confirmed against his calendar in 3 separate instances. Jokes about donors I recognized by name. References to hotels and cities he had traveled to for the foundation. And threaded through everything were discussions about redirecting what they called excess funds. Excess funds meant scholarship allocations. The consulting firm was registered under her name. A woman named Petra Voss, listed publicly on nothing, but deeply embedded in Julian's private world. The transfers were not errors. They bore Julian's authorization codes on every line. I read the thread twice. Then I set the tablet back precisely as I found it, screen down. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water I did not drink. And I began, very quietly, to plan. I did not cry that night. I have thought about that often since, why there were no tears. I think it is because grief and betrayal, for me, do not arrive in floods. They arrive as cold, clarifying data. The body processes shock differently when the mind has already begun organizing the evidence. The affair hurt. That much was true and clean. 4 years of shared mornings and practiced intimacies, that loss had weight. But what hollowed me more completely was not the other woman. It was the architecture of the deception. The precision of it. Julian had not stumbled into something. He had built something. And what lingered longest, past the hurt, past the hollow, was a single line he had written to her in one of the earlier messages. She trusts me completely. I read it 3 times. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to memorize the exact way those words felt so that I would never confuse them for anything other than what they were. Trust converted into leverage. I closed the cloud syncing app on my phone and cleared the session. I went to bed. I lay beside Julian Mercer in the dark and listened to him breathe. I did not sleep. I recalculated. Silence unsettles the guilty. I knew this from years of sitting across conference tables from executives who had falsified reports and shredded inconvenient records. The ones who cracked earliest were not the ones we confronted. They were the ones we simply watched, patiently, without expression, until the weight of unspoken knowledge became unbearable. I gave Julian none of that. I gave him the opposite. I smiled at dinner. I asked about the gala preparations with genuine-sounding enthusiasm. I reviewed the guest lists he needed me to cross-reference and suggested menu adjustments for dietary restrictions. I asked about his speech draft and told him the opening was strong. Julian grew more relaxed, not less. He mistook composure for ignorance. He always had. It was, I realized, one of his foundational assumptions about me, that my steadiness came from simplicity. That I was calm because I did not see deeply. That my reliability was the product of a limited imagination. He had spent 4 years benefiting from my precision without ever wondering what it might look like turned toward him. I let him keep assuming. I began a second notebook. Encrypted. Dated. Methodical. I made no mistakes. I am exceptionally good at my job. I say that not with pride but with precision, because it matters to understand what happened next. Forensic accounting is not glamorous work. It is patient, painstaking, and requires the capacity to hold enormous complexity without losing the thread. Most people, confronted with what I found in Julian's finances, would have either confronted him immediately or dissolved. They would not have known where to look next. I knew exactly where to look. I began with the consulting firm, the entity registered to Petrovos. No employees listed with any labor authority. No registered office address beyond a mailbox service. No website. No public presence of any kind. A corporate ghost, assembled with just enough paperwork to receive wire transfers legally. From there I followed the money. Foundation deposits cleared. Within 48 hours, a percentage transferred to the consulting firm's account. From there, the funds moved again, into a private investment portfolio I traced through secondary filings to a holding account in Julian's name. The architecture was elegant. Fraud often is. The most dangerous financial crimes are not messy. They are beautiful. They are built by intelligent people who understand exactly which systems rely on trust rather than verification. Julian had built something genuinely impressive. And now I was dismantling it, thread by thread. Julian's private study had always been off-limits. He called it professional necessity. Donor confidentiality. I had never questioned it. Not because I was incurious, but because some territories in a shared life require deliberate respect. I understood the value of private space. I kept my own. But private space and hidden evidence are different categories. I did not force the lock. I am too careful for forced entry. Instead, over the course of 3 days, I researched the specific lock model and ordered a matching replacement key set through a locksmith supply channel, citing a lost key on a cabinet of the same model. When the replacement arrived, it worked. Inside Julian's study drawer were backdated contracts, advisory agreements between the foundation and Petrovos's firm, signed and dated to predate the financial transfers by enough months to create legal plausibility. Fabricated deliverable reports. Printed travel confirmations for board retreats that corresponded precisely to the romantic messages I had already catalogued. And photographs. Julian and Petrovos in hotel corridors and restaurant booths and what appeared to be an apartment I did not recognize. Smiling in ways I had not seen him smile in longer than I cared to calculate. I photographed every document with my private device. Then I locked the drawer. I replaced the key set in its original packaging. He never noticed. I needed a professional opinion without triggering a professional alarm. The distinction matters. I could not walk into any attorney's office and name Julian Mercer without risking a leak. His social network was too well maintained, his reputation too carefully cultivated across this city. One whisper to the wrong person and I would lose the element I needed most: time. Instead, I contacted a compliance specialist I had worked with 3 years prior on an unrelated corporate matter. A careful man, discreet by nature and by professional obligation. I invited him for coffee and presented my situation as purely hypothetical. A fictional nonprofit director, I said. A fictional shell advisory firm. Fictional wire transfers from charitable funds into a private investment account, structured across 18 months. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he set his coffee cup down and answered in the same measured tone I had used. Criminal investigation, near certainly. Non-profit fraud at that scale triggers mandatory regulatory review. Asset freeze pending investigation is standard. Public exposure is almost inevitable given the board notification requirements. He paused. The fictional director would need to have a very good attorney and a very cooperative disposition to avoid prosecution. I thanked him. I drove home slowly. And I began timing the exposure with the same precision Julian had used to build his architecture. The more I traced, the clearer the full picture became. And the full picture was worse than the affair. Worse, even, than the financial theft, because the theft had a target, and that target was not abstract. It was the scholarship fund. Young people who had been told by this foundation, by Julian Mercer personally, that their futures were secured. That the world had seen their potential and chosen to invest in it. Those funds were being redirected. Into Petrovos's shell firm. Into Julian's private investment account. And from there, through filings I traced with painstaking care across 2 late nights, into the early infrastructure of a private venture registered in the Netherlands. A clean exit strategy. One final fundraising surge, his 40th birthday gala, and then dissolution of the foundation. Assets transitioned abroad under the cover of strategic restructuring. The scholarships were never the mission. They were the branding. The donors were not partners. They were resources. And my credibility, my steady presence at Julian's side, my professional reputation lending quiet legitimacy to every public-facing moment, I had been infrastructure. A feature of the architecture. A detail that made the whole construction look trustworthy. I stopped feeling like a girlfriend. I started feeling like I had been filed under assets. That was the moment everything inside me went very still and very certain. I built the complete timeline on a single sheet of paper, encrypted behind 2 passwords, stored on the device Julian did not know I owned. The affair had begun 9 months ago. Based on the earliest message timestamps and the first evidence of a shift in Julian's behavior that I could now reframe through accurate context. The financial transfers had begun 10 months ago. He had secured the financial architecture before he secured her emotionally. That sequence was deliberate. The system had to be operational before any risk was introduced. He had prioritized the mechanism over the relationship. Even the affair, in the end, was subordinate to the money. I sat with that for a long time. Not because it wounded me, I had moved past the wound by now, into something colder and more functional. But because it told me something important about how Julian Mercer thought. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He planned sequentially. He mitigated risk with elegant patience. Which meant he would not expect the same from me. He had written she trusts me completely and believed it as a permanent condition rather than a temporary mercy. That realization did not shatter me. It reorganized me entirely. I folded the timeline and secured it. Then I moved to the next phase. There is a morning that I return to sometimes, not with pain, but with something like clarity. It was a Thursday. Julian was leaving early for a donor luncheon. He was in good spirits. The gala planning was going well, the final guest count was strong, and a journalist from a regional culture magazine had confirmed attendance for a profile piece. He kissed me before leaving, his hand resting briefly on the side of my face. "I'm lucky to have you," he said. I held his gaze. He meant it, I think, in his way. Not as a lie but as the particular truth of a man who had compartmentalized so thoroughly that affection and betrayal no longer felt contradictory to him. He loved the version of me that served his construction. The steady one. The credible one. The one who asked no uncomfortable questions and lent her quiet legitimacy to rooms she walked into on his arm. I looked at him and felt nothing dramatic. No rage. No grief. No impulse to speak. Just the clean, focused certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly why. Luck, I thought, had nothing to do with it. I had never been the lucky one in this arrangement. I had been the overlooked one. And those are very different things. I began separating my financial life from Julian's quietly and with absolute precision. We did not share accounts. Julian had always preferred to keep foundation finances and personal finances distinct from our household arrangements, which in retrospect was simply one more layer of design. But we shared a financial planner, a joint investment vehicle from our second year together, and my name appeared on the deed to the Alder Street property as secondary holder. I retained a private attorney, not a local firm, someone practiced in a city 3 hours away with no professional overlap with Julian's network. I presented the situation in full. She was efficient, appropriately unsurprised, and outlined the steps I needed to take before any public action. I transferred my personal savings into accounts under my name alone, structured as a portfolio rebalancing, nothing unusual for someone in my field. I removed my name from the joint investment vehicle under the justification of simplified tax reporting. I requested preliminary documentation on the deed. Emotionally, I had already left the house on Alder Street. I had left it the night I read that email thread and set the tablet back face down on the table. Physically, I simply needed to wait for the right room. And Julian was building me one, a grand ballroom, 200 guests, a podium, and a projector. He was, as always, meticulous in his preparations. So was I. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in gold light and the soft collision of crystal glasses. Julian dressed with care. The dark suit I had always thought suited him best, cufflinks from a set his father had given him, a pocket square in deep burgundy. He stood before the mirror longer than usual. This was his night. His philanthropic legacy, publicly celebrated. His 40th birthday rendered into fundraising theater for 200 of the city's most generous and most connected people. I dressed carefully too. The ballroom of the Hargrove Hotel had been transformed. Floral arrangements framing the stage, round tables dressed in ivory, a standing cocktail area near the entrance where early arrivals gathered in clusters of warmth and expectation. Staff moved through the room with the rehearsed smoothness of a well-funded event. Petra Voss was introduced near the stage as our strategic visionary, a title that apparently satisfied the room without requiring elaboration. She was polished. I gave her that. She had the easy confidence of someone who believes she is operating within a system she controls. Julian squeezed my hand as we took our position near the front. "This is what we built," he said quietly. He meant the room, the evening, the image. He stepped to the microphone. "This foundation," he began, voice steady and warm, "is built on trust." The word rose into the gilded air. And I checked the time. At 8:17 p.m., the oversight authorities delivered formal inquiry notices to every board member and major donor with a direct stake in the foundation. I had submitted the documented request for regulatory review 3 days prior, not a dramatic accusation, but a structured, evidence-supported filing, the kind my professional background equipped me to prepare with precision. The kind that carries institutional weight. The kind that triggers automatic notifications under nonprofit compliance law. I had scheduled the delivery for 8:17 p.m. The exact minute Julian's speech notes indicated he would begin his opening remarks. The first phones lit up near the back of the room, a board member in a charcoal suit, then the woman beside him. Then a cascade, small screens brightening under tables, the soft buzz of notifications cutting beneath the sound of Julian's voice. I watched the information move through the room the way I watch a transaction trail, from point to point, clean and irreversible. Julian faltered mid-sentence. Not dramatically. A single lost word. A slight recalibration. But I saw it. And the board members exchanging glances saw something too, though they did not yet know what they were seeing. Confusion tightened the air like a change in atmospheric pressure. Julian did not know yet. But the ground beneath him had already shifted. I rose from my seat and walked toward the stage with the same unhurried composure I bring to every difficult room. Not rushing. Not performing. Simply moving with the deliberate calm of someone who has already done the hard work and is now simply present for the conclusion. Julian saw me coming. His expression was careful, a controlled question behind steady eyes. He did not know what was happening with the phones. He did not know about the regulatory filing. But he had enough instinct to feel that something had changed in the atmosphere of his own event. When I reached the base of the stage, I looked up at him. "May I?" I asked simply. He hesitated, that half-second of calculation, and then handed me the microphone. Even now, in a room full of confusion, he defaulted to the assumption that I was an asset to be used. That I was there to help him manage whatever this was. He was not entirely wrong. As someone trained in forensic accounting, I began, my voice even and clear in the ballroom's acoustics, I believe transparency is what protects institutional integrity. I nodded to the venue technician I had briefed earlier that afternoon. The presentation screen behind me shifted. Transaction logs appeared. Entity registrations. Wire transfer records. A layered, annotated documentation trail. Clean, sourced, undeniable. No accusations. Just facts. The room went completely silent. Gasps. Then silence deeper than the gasps. Board members began comparing what was on the screen with what had arrived on their phones minutes earlier. A donor near the center of the room leaned toward the man beside him and said something in a low voice. Journalists at the press table were recording, phones raised, notebooks opened, the focused stillness of people who understand they are watching something that will require words tomorrow. Julian stepped forward. He had gathered himself with impressive speed. I will give him that. Whatever he felt in that moment, shock, anger, fear, he channeled it into the polished composure that had served him for 4 decades in rooms that required performance. I want to assure everyone, he said, voice measured and warm, that this is a misunderstanding. But documentation does not blush. It does not waver under the heat of a confident voice or the steady eye contact of a practiced man. It exists independent of personality, of charm, of the careful social equity Julian Mercer had spent years accumulating. Across the room, board members were not looking at Julian. They were looking at their phones. On the screen. At the numbers. And near the back of the ballroom, Petrovos had begun moving, slowly, casually, the careful exit of someone who has assessed the situation and decided the math no longer favors staying. The questions came from the crowd with the controlled precision of people who have something at stake and want answers. A board member in the third row, a woman I had met at least a dozen times at foundation events, stood without waiting to be recognized. She named specific transaction dates. She cross-referenced them with the entity registration visible on screen. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of someone whose professional reputation is now in the same room as a potential scandal and who will not accept a vague reply. Julian answered in broad strokes. Strategic partnerships. Compliant advisory structures. A review process he was confident would clarify everything. But broad strokes do not hold up against documented specifics. And with every answer that failed to address a direct question, the room's patience eroded further. Then a journalist near the press table called out her name, Petrovos, and asked for comment on her role in the advisory firm. Julian, in the reflexive instinct of a man whose composure had thinned past its limit, called her name himself, not her title, not her professional role. Her name. The intimate, unguarded use of it. The room understood before any spreadsheet could have told them. The illusion did not just crack. It fractured, audibly, completely, across 200 witnesses. And Petrovos stopped moving toward the exit. Backstage, a narrow corridor lined with folding equipment cases and the infrastructure of a celebrated evening, Julian found me. He was still controlled. But the quality of his control had changed. It was no longer polished. It was pressurized, the kind that comes from containing something that is expanding faster than the container allows. He took hold of my arm, gently but deliberately. Serena. His voice was low. What are you doing? I looked at him with the same clarity I had carried since that Tuesday night months ago. No performance. No rage. The simple, unhurried certainty of someone who knows precisely where they stand. Correcting the narrative, I said. You're humiliating me. His jaw tightened. In front of every person who matters in this city. I held his gaze. No, I replied. I'm revealing you. There is a difference. Something moved through his expression then, not anger, exactly. Closer to recalibration. Like a man rapidly revising a foundational assumption he had carried for too long. He had believed, in the deepest operational layer of his planning, that I was predictable. That my composure was the composure of someone who does not look closely. That my loyalty was reflexive rather than chosen. For the first time, standing in that corridor, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of the law. Not of the donors. Of me. By morning, the shape of everything had changed. 2 of the Foundation's major donors, both individuals whose contributions represented significant percentages of annual operating capacity, submitted formal withdrawal notices before noon. One released a brief statement through their communications team expressing concern about governance and committing to a full review of their charitable partnerships. The regulatory authority escalated the inquiry from a documentary review to a formal investigation. Standard procedure, given the scope of what the initial filing had documented. The Foundation's operating accounts were frozen pending investigation. Staff received formal notices before the workday ended. Program activities, including the scholarship disbursements scheduled for the spring cycle, were suspended indefinitely. Press coverage shifted with the clean efficiency of an industry that runs on narrative. The profile piece in the regional culture magazine, the one that had been scheduled to run the following month under a title about visionary philanthropy, was pulled. Julian Mercer's name, which had for years appeared in this city's press alongside words like transformative and visionary and dedicated, now appeared beside words like investigation and inquiry, and questions remain. There was no dramatic public collapse. No shouting in the streets. Just the methodical, institutional dismantling of a construction built on false foundations. Which is, I have always believed, exactly how these things should end. He sent the messages in waves. The first wave arrived within hours of the gala, long, urgent, structured like a legal brief. Explanations. Context. Claims of mischaracterization. The careful language of a man who had already consulted or was in the process of consulting an attorney and was testing what narrative remained viable. The second wave was apology. Broad, earnest-sounding, calibrated to the emotional rather than the factual. References to our 4 years. Suggestions that what we had was real even if his choices had been wrong. An implication that my actions had been disproportionate to the injury. I did not respond to either wave. The third wave was blame, quieter than the others, and perhaps the most honest. A message that suggested I had chosen the public option when a private conversation would have been possible. That I had prioritized spectacle over resolution. That I had, in his words, destroyed what didn't need to be destroyed. I read that one twice. Then I set my phone down. Publicly, Julian characterized what had occurred as administrative oversight under review. A phrase designed to sound procedural rather than catastrophic. A phrase that does significant work in the right circles. Privately, he sent one final message asking if we could fix this. There are systems you cannot repair once their architecture has been fully exposed. Trust is one of them. He knew that better than anyone. Legal proceedings move with a particular rhythm, not fast, not dramatic, but inexorable. Like the progression of a well-constructed audit. The investigation into the foundation's finances ran for several months. The documentary evidence I had provided, transaction logs, entity registrations, transfer records, the backdated contracts from the locked study, formed the foundational layer of what became a significantly larger case once regulatory investigators began their own expansion of the record. Petra Voss cooperated early. I was told this by my attorney in the neutral, informational tone that legal counsel uses when sharing developments that are relevant but not central to a client's own position. Cooperation, in these proceedings, tends to shape outcomes. It shaped hers. Julian's foundation was dissolved. Fines were levied. Restitution was ordered, a portion of which was directed back toward the scholarship fund, though the fund itself would require restructuring under new governance before it could resume operations. His name appeared in investigation reports for an extended period. The kind of sustained press attention that follows a person regardless of geography or reinvention. There was no dramatic courtroom moment. No final public reckoning where justice arrived wearing ceremony. Just the slow, thorough collapse of a construction that had never been as solid as it appeared. Which is, of course, always how it goes when you build on false foundations. The ground does not announce its softness. It simply gives way. He asked to see me one final time, and I agreed, because I had said what I needed to say in the right room at the right moment and carried nothing additional that required a stage. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had ever frequented together. His suggestion, I noted, the careful choice of neutral ground. He looked different. Not diminished exactly. More like a man who had been required, for the first time in his life, to reckon with consequence rather than simply manage its perception. He sat across from me and studied the table for a moment before speaking. You could have handled this privately, he said. Come to me. Given me the chance to. I did, I answered. For months. He went quiet. I documented everything. I continued, not unkindly. I secured legal counsel. I separated my finances. I filed with regulatory authorities. All of that was private. The gala was simply the moment I chose to make it visible. He looked up, and in his expression, in the particular quality of recognition that moved through it, I could see the moment he finally understood what he had been living beside. Not a woman who didn't see. Not a woman who trusted blindly. A woman who had seen everything, calculated everything, and chosen the time and the room with the same precision he had used to build his fraud. I stood. You miscalculated, I said. And I left. I moved into a smaller townhouse across the river in early spring. No historic facade. No crown molding carrying the weight of someone else's family history. No curated dinner parties where admiration was the currency and I was expected to circulate graciously in the margins of Julian's spotlight. Just clean walls. Honest space. Light that came through windows that belonged to nothing other than the life I was choosing. The older street property was handled through legal channels. My name had been on the deed, and the resolution was straightforward once the broader proceedings removed complications. I reclaimed my work with a focus that felt different from what it had been during the years on Alder Street. Sharper. More fully mine. I took on 2 cases I had previously declined on the grounds of time I was, in retrospect, giving to a life I should have examined sooner. I transferred the funds I had carefully separated during the preparation months into long-term accounts structured for my own future. I met with a financial planner who knew nothing about Julian Mercer and was not interested in knowing. I booked a solo trip to a country I had wanted to visit for 11 years and never gone to because the timing had never aligned with Julian's schedule. And I let silence become peace instead of strategy. For the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I slept without replaying anything. I simply slept. People imagine revenge as rage. It isn't. It is restraint sharpened into precision over time. It is the long, disciplined choice not to act until the moment is right, the evidence is complete, the exit is secured, and the room is full of the right witnesses. It is the decision to feel the wound cleanly rather than poorly, and to convert that feeling not into destruction but into clarity. Julian Mercer believed I was the quiet one. The steady presence in the background of his spotlight. The loyal, predictable structure beneath a more visible architecture. He had spent 4 years assuming that my composure was born of limited perception rather than deliberate restraint. He was wrong about what I saw. He was wrong about when I chose to act. And he was wrong about what I was capable of, which is the most fundamental error a person can make about someone standing this close. I did not scream when I found the emails. I did not beg when I understood the full shape of what he had built. I did not collapse in the corridor backstage when he looked at me with something approaching fear for the first time. I waited. I prepared. And when the moment arrived, I stood in a room full of witnesses and told the truth with every document to support it. Because the most dangerous mistake a man can make, in love, in fraud, in the careful construction of a life built on other people's trust, is to underestimate a woman who has been paying attention. I was always paying attention.